There's been years and years ago, people talked about speed jumpers or power jumpers. It's easy to give to give a label to something. Essentially, I believe it's on a continuum. We get jumpers who are slower takeoff, and we get jumpers who are faster. Long jumpers have a window of maybe 200ths of a second between a slower takeoff athlete and a faster athlete. In the high jump, it's 8 and 900ths of a second. So Costa Dinova, when she broke the world record, was actually recorded at 0.125 of a second. And I've seen data on Sotomayor in his younger days at 0.21 of a second. They're the two extremes. Typically, if you look at the athlete jumping, the speed flopper, everything happens faster. There's less overt movement of the free limbs, less flexion, quicker recovery. It's much more elastic, it's much more tendon-based, whereas what you might call the power flopper, the slower jumper, is far more muscular. And we see a lot of US jumpers, especially the guys who've maybe come from a basketball background. They have certain traits in the way they jump, which I will put them in the power end of the spectrum, and maybe that's reflected by in their training. There are differences in the swimming limb components, and that's something we'll actually look at later. And really, you need to analyze the athletes you're working with and determine which type of athlete, has your athlete got more elastic fibers in their jumping mechanism, or are they much more muscular? Because that does have implications for the way that they train. Look at a great example, great exponent of the quicker end of the spectrum, Barshim, 0.13, 0.14 of a second on a bad day. Very smooth controlled running, increase in rhythm at the end. Looks all more like a long jump as he takes off, but he's able to convert and jump very, very high. If we look at his takeoff position, that wouldn't do a long jumper too much disservice, I would suggest. On the other end in the spectrum, Jamal Wilson, this jump, he took 0.19 of a second, and he's probably the slowest at the World Championships and in recent years. But there are marked differences in the way he implements the takeoff. So if we just move the video along to what happens here, the leg is further out in front, and you almost get the impression of a block. He's working so hard to convert that horizontal velocity into vertical velocity. You almost see his right hip move backwards, and he's unable to control the forces like Barshim. So there's noticeable flexion at the hip. The effect of this is that the free leg comes through more slowly, more open, and basically drags against the floor. So that's an extreme example to use, is at the slower, more muscular end of the spectrum. And one of the issues that you'll find is that because of that flexing force, it distorts the ankle, and we get the typical outer heel lift of the jump. But he will take longer to actually get that free leg through, so comes up very high at the end, and he's much more deliberate in his arm action. So as I said, more overt swinging movements. If we look at these two jumpers, Yilma Huchik, 2.6 recently, still only 19, and Gerashenko, two Ukrainians, markedly different in build and also in the way that they approach the takeoff. So they're penultimate. If we look here, Gerashenko on the right, I would suggest looks a lot more controlled. It's more powerful in her penultimate contact against the ground, whereas Mahuchik looks like a little girl. Literally, it's a little tippy toe contact, not a huge amount of pressure and force being applied. But she must have something in the legs to jump 206. As you come through to plant, if we look at the hip position, you immediately see that Mahuchik basically buckles a little bit like Jamal Wilson did, except she is at the faster end of the spectrum. And you can immediately see, as well as the hip dropping, we see the forces distorting the ankle, causing overpronation. And the reason that happens is her knee hardly flexes, and the forces get transmitted through to the floor. If we compare Gerashenko, far more mature, much more muscular, the hip still drops but recovers very quickly as the knee comes through, and the foot is far more stable. So you get the impression from Gerashenko of her planting and lifting through the takeoff, whereas Mahuchik is buckling and then trying to salvage it. The effect of this, if you compare two athletes, and these are this young lady at the bottom, this is when she was 18, 19 years old. She's a 190 plus jumper now. At the time, this young lady was one of our UK number ones. But you can see from a position on the right where they're almost identical when they put the foot down, what happens if you're not able to control those forces that go through the hip and the knee. You get this flexion here, and the result is seen at the end of the takeoff, where the knee has gone over the toe, which immediately is reducing the force that can be generated by that left leg. Again, another indication is that there's plantar flexion in the free leg, and that's almost continued through to the takeoff. Whereas what we want to see is this nice, strong, extended position as the athlete leaves the ground, if they are able to control the forces through this part of the takeoff. So that shows you the difference between a mature athlete, well-conditioned, and a young developing athlete. So this would be something typically that you would see with young athletes. If we look at Jamal again, if you look at this, there's a little graph on the side of the screen, and this indicates the red indicates the time at which the hip fires in the takeoff. The yellow indicates when the knee fires, and the grey indicates when the ankle fires. So typically what we want to see is the hip. If you're trying to get nicely coordinated triple extension, we want to see the hip firing before the knee, before the ankle. Very, very close together. Obviously, it's a synchronous movement. But with Wilson, we see here that it's very much a knee-dominant jump. So his hip has not prevented his knee flexing. So it's the knee that's taking the load in the middle of the takeoff. At this point, the hip, as you see, has collapsed, so it's not really contributing. And it's only when he comes out of that position that the hip can then start to contribute to the takeoff, and then the ankle finishes the takeoff. So typically we want to see something more like Barshim. Again, Barshim has a very, very fast takeoff. So his ankle fires very quickly. Whereas if we look at some other athletes, you would get this, the red would be down here, the yellow. Imagine swapping these two around and then having the ankle firing more towards the end. We tend not to see an open swing leg in ladies, by the way, very, very rare, which then seems to suggest that it's a very much a technique which is suitable or can be adopted and utilized by a man. So if that's a quick look at the forces that we have to overcome and develop, but we also have to create rotation. So the trick is you have to move from upright to horizontal, and you have to move from facing the bar to having your back to the bar. And the time in which you have to do this is fractions of a second. Again, depending the type of jumper you are and the style that you're able to adapt to. between 0.13 and 0.21 of a second. In the World Championships in London, I think the slowest jumper was 0.19, but historically there have been slower jumpers. So you have to move the body in 3 dimensions. Now, going back to the penultimate, which is not, as I said, strictly part of the takeoff, I think this little video comparison will highlight the importance of the penultimate. And it is critical. It'll help you set up a takeoff, or it ruins it. So I just let it run through first. Don't know why that's happening. Okay, so the critical point is there's the penultimate with the young lad. And this lad cleared 2.6 on this jump. He was a talented junior jumper, but you can see the position he's in here. He's not really giving himself a chance of making an efficient takeoff. Whereas the athlete on the right, well, still only a relative youngster, a lot taller, a lot stronger, a lot more controlled, and therefore can generate power from the penultimate into the takeoff. So again, the one athlete on the left, hips are still relatively high and the foot is moving down into the plant. The young lad on the right, he's not lifting the hips as he comes off the penultimate, he's sliding forward and basically pokes the leg out. And you can see before we look at the movements that follow, that is going to be a big braking effect. And you can see what happens. The upper body almost stops dead. You can imagine the forces going from the knee out through the hip in this direction. So he's basically killed the spring that he's got. Just to go back over this, the fact that the importance of being tall on the penultimate is absolutely paramount in terms of letting you go into the plant position where you can develop effective forces. And you can see there the difference between a youngster who needs some technical input. There's absolutely no way you're going to be able to develop an effective takeoff and maintain a good position above the bar. Whatever foot contact you decide to use, whether it's on the ball of the foot, flat-footed or on the heel, every jumper at top level will have, and even Derek Druin, the heel will touch the ground in the penultimate contact, which goes to show that you are trying to develop huge forces, and that without that, you'll have a weak start to the actual takeoff.